We're beginning a new unit today talking about the Cold War. The Cold War references the time period that starts basically at the very end of World War II. At the end of World War II, we know that the Allies, specifically the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, are going to take those defeated countries in Europe and we are going to divide them up and control them. The whole purpose was to recreate and reestablish their government so they would be on firm footing and be very stable before we left. We were attempting to prevent another incident like what happened after World War I, which directly led to World War II. Harry Truman and the United States, as well as Great Britain and other Western European nations, were pushing for free elections, meaning that we wanted to establish democratic governments in those areas. However, Eastern Europe, led by the Soviet Union, were all pushing for communist governments. Winston Churchill, who is seen in the bottom right picture, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II and after, is going to give a speech in which he discusses an iron curtain that is going to descend over all of Eastern Europe. This was talking about all of those countries in Eastern Europe that had been come under the control of the Soviet Union. These are going to be referred to as satellite nations, those mostly Eastern European countries that were aligned with and also under the influence of the Soviet Union. Stalin did anything to get rid of people who disagreed with him. He is going to be responsible for the murder of anywhere up to 10, 12 million of his own citizens, simply because they disagreed with his politics. He was hoping to create a buffer zone, or an area of protection, between the USSR and the rest of Europe. Containment. This is a very important word to know. Containment is a theory that is discussing trying to stop the spread of communism. It was introduced by a man named George Kennan. And this becomes the foundation of U.S. foreign policy after World War II. Imagine we want to put communism in a container and put a lid on it. Almost everything we did from the end of World War II all the way into the late 1980s into the early 90s is going to be an attempt to keep communism from spreading. The question is, why did so many people want to become communist? If you remember, during World War II, many nations were totally destroyed. And in order to rebuild, they were going to need a tremendous amount of money. The Soviets were willing to come in and give or loan that money to these nations as long as they agreed to become communist. Communism also promised to get rid of poverty. And anyone at this point who was poor, being communist where everyone is the same, did not seem too bad. The United States, whose system is capitalist, is very different from a communist system. So we obviously did not want communism to spread. But did we want to go to war? The answer to that question is no. We just came out of World War II and had no desire to enter into another war. So the term Cold War is going to be applied here, and it refers to the theories of democracy versus communism and the competition between the United States and the USSR. When Greece and Turkey were very close to becoming communist in 1947, Harry Truman steps in and adds on to the United States foreign policy, introducing what becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine stated that we, the United States, would give aid to any nation that needed it in order to prevent communism. We will take this foreign policy and build on it with the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is going to be designed to help rebuild Europe. Remember, Europe was totally destroyed by this war, and that devastation and the fact that so many people were poor made communism very promising. So George Marshall, who was our Secretary of State, creates a recovery plan for Europe, where we offer money and loans to any nation to rebuild. Again, this is going to prevent communist nations from coming in and offering money and then taking over. This particular plan was a tremendous success. You see here in this picture, the picture on the left was 1947, 2 years after the war is over, and you see all the devastation that is still there. After the Marshall Plan money comes in, they were able to rebuild, and a short 8 years later, they are able to totally rebuild. This was a great success, and eventually Europe does pay back this money. The Soviet Union is not going to give up. Remember that we split Germany up in order to control it and to rebuild it. Germany is going to be divided into East and West Germany, as well as its capital, Berlin. Now, Berlin was located in eastern Germany. East again is communist, West is democratic. The Soviets were hoping to make East Germany its own country. So what they decided to do was to try to take over the capital in an effort to create a new nation of East Germany. So they are going to blockade it. A blockade means that nothing comes in and nothing goes out. They felt like if they could blockade Berlin long enough, that the people of West Berlin would eventually run out of supplies and have to turn to Soviet aid, which would then give the capital to the Soviets. The United States decided that we were not going to allow that to happen. So, again, we did not want to go directly to war. If we had made an attempt to go through the blockade, if we rolled tanks through it, for example, that would mean certain war. Instead, we decided to go over the blockade, and we airlifted supplies directly to the city instead of backing down. We airlifted these supplies for nearly an entire year and brought in over 2 million tons of supplies. Supplies like milk, like you see here in this bottom right cartoon. The Soviets recognized their defeat and finally lift the blockade. This was considered a major victory for the Allies and for the United States. The Cold War is going to bring up many new risk and security problems. Harry Truman is seen here signing in the National Security Act in 1947. This is going to create a new cabinet position with the Department of Defense and creates the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency that handles foreign intelligence, as well as the NSC, or National Security Council. The National Security Council advises the presidents on foreign policy matters as well as security threats. For the first time, the United States is going to totally end our isolationism when we join NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We are going to join a mutual defense alliance of other Western democratic nations as a way to protect ourselves and those other NATO countries. The Cold War continues to heat up when the atomic bomb was tested in the Soviet Union in 1949. The United States is no longer the only nation with an atomic bomb. This definitely is going to balance out the power between the United States and the Soviet Union. It also doesn't take very long for the Soviet Union to create their own defense alliance. This one is called the Warsaw Pact and unites communist nations. Again, another defense alliance. You see in this picture here on the left, all the nations in the turquoise color are NATO countries, and those in red are Warsaw Pact countries. The Cold War will see many conflicts throughout from the 1945 through the late 1980s into the early 1990s. So remember, the Cold War and the U.S. policy of containment is going to be key when we talk about almost every event in U.S. history from here till the early 1990s.